It's my pleasure to ask Dale Newman, Dr. Dale Newman, to come up and introduce our speaker this evening. Please welcome Dr. Newman.
Thank you, Kimberly, and welcome. As she's indicated, I'm head of the Truman Center at UMKC, and I've been doing that for almost 10 years now, and we've enjoyed our association with the archives and our other partners. If I brought his entire resume up here, I'd take the entire time allotted for the lecture, so I've abbreviated it somewhat. It'll take me a minute or two to get through it. Larry Haas is a former senior White House official and award-winning journalist, a senior fellow for U.S. foreign policy at the American Foreign Policy Council. He's a columnist, an author, and a public affairs consultant. He writes widely on foreign and domestic affairs, is quoted often in newspapers and magazines, and appears frequently on television and radio. He was educated at the University of Pennsylvania. He had an undergraduate degree there, summa cum laude with distinction, Phi Beta Kappa. He got his master's degree in history at Princeton University in 1980. He's written a number of things, syndicated column on foreign affairs for U.S. News and World Report, the McClatchy Tribune News Service, and others. He's written op-eds for a wide variety of outlets, including New York Times, USA Today, Los Angeles Times, and a number of others. He has 3 books, and many chapters and articles I'm not going to cite, but his 3 books are Gary and Arthur, Truman, Vandenberg, and the Partnership That Created the Free World, what he's going to speak about and from tonight. Sound of the Trumpet, the United States and Human Rights Promotion, published by Latham, Roman, and Littlefield in 2012, and Running on Empty, Bush, Congress, and the Politics of a Bankrupt Government, New York, Business Lumber, and published in 1990. He's been active in public affairs as well. He worked in the Obama Transition Office, the Office of Managed Budget and Confirmation Team. He's worked in private industry. He was assistant to Yale University president. He worked in the White House as communication director for Vice President Al Gore in 1998, and also communications director for Office of Management Budget in 1998. As I said, the list is longer, but I think I've given you enough of his resume so you understand he knows wherever he speaks. Larry.
Well, thank you, Dale. Thank you very much for that generous introduction. I greatly appreciate it. You know, a lot of times people like to embellish resumes and biographies, particularly in Washington. There's this old Washington expression, thank you so much for what you said that's true, but thank you in particular for what you said that isn't. But yours was rather factual, so I can't really thank you for anything that you said that isn't true. Just a factual recitation of my work over the years. But thank you very much. Thank you, of course, to everyone at the sponsoring organizations for inviting me to speak, for arranging my visit, and for providing me with such a rich array of activities that I've been enjoying while I'm here, the Harry S. Truman Center for Governmental Affairs at the University of Missouri, Kansas City, the Truman Presidential Library, and the International Relations Council. I do want to thank in particular Dale, who you just heard from, the program director at the Truman Center, and Gayla Curtis, program specialist and assistant to the director, because they're the ones who really made all of this and my activities in over the course of 3 days happen. And thank you to the National Archives in Kansas City for hosting this event, and of course, thanks to every single one of you for coming out tonight. I'm going to speak for about 25 or so minutes, and then I hope we can have a good discussion through Q&A. I'm going to tell you a little bit about why I wrote this book. I'm going to give you, I hope, just enough to whet your appetite and to make the book signing line longer than it would otherwise be. And I'm going to finish with some thoughts on what I think we should take from the book and the content that's in it. Ladies and gentlemen, historians often choose what stories to write about because they're inspired by current events. And in that spirit, I wanted to write about the birth of the free world because I thought it was a particularly important story to tell now for a few reasons. For one thing, we Americans in recent years have been rethinking our global role. President Obama has worked to reduce America's footprint around the world. to share burdens with our allies and even our adversaries, and to focus on what he calls nation building here at home. And at the same time, we Americans as a people, have become more isolationist, less interested in the world, and more fearful that we can no longer afford our global role. And for another thing, I wanted to address two myths about our current era. First, that our politics have never been more partisan, and second, that we have never faced such a tough set of challenges at home and abroad. Neither of those notions is remotely true, especially when stacked up against our experience of the late 1940s. As I began my research about the birth of the free world, I discovered that no one had told the particular story of Harry Truman and Arthur Vandenberg. And the opportunity to tell an untold story is always very appealing to an author. So, Harry and Arthur is, in fact, the untold story of a unique partnership of bipartisanship at a bitterly partisan time, and of two very different men who overcame great obstacles to do great things. That's what's inspiring and instructive and timely about this story. So let's dig in. On the morning of April 12th, 1945, just a little over 71 years ago to today, Harry Truman was Vice President of the United States. Arthur Vandenberg was the top Republican on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And with President Roosevelt's death later that day in Warm Springs, Georgia, Truman and Vandenberg would inherit a world in great turmoil. In Europe, World War II was ending, with US and Soviet troops converging on Germany from different sides. In London, members of Parliament jokingly traded premature rumors that Hitler was dead. In Paris, the lights have returned, illuminating the Champs-Élysées and the Notre Dame and the other historic sites. But the good feelings could not hide a very bleak reality. The fighting had devastated the continent and its once proud people. 40 million were dead. Millions more were uprooted, including many lost or orphaned children. Europe's infrastructure was flattened, and its economy was barely functioning. More than half of the housing in its major cities was rubble. Hundreds of ships, thousands of bridges, and tens of thousands of miles of rail were destroyed. Many farms were barren, and as a result, many Europeans were starving. And most Europeans were consuming just half to two-thirds of their pre-war calories. As one historian later wrote, the four horsemen of the apocalypse, pestilence, war, famine, and death, so familiar during the Middle Ages, appeared again in the modern world. There would be no return of the old order, with the traditional powers on the continent keeping the peace. Britain, France, and the other old powers were struggling just to survive. And while the Soviets were technically still one of the Allies, they were quickly turning into a dangerous new adversary of the West. Joseph Stalin was breaking all of his promises to Roosevelt to allow for free elections in Poland and elsewhere across Eastern Europe, and in the weeks leading up to Roosevelt's death, the cables between him and Stalin had grown very icy. Now, with Europe in such a dire condition, the situation was ripe for the Soviets to march across Europe, the Mediterranean, and beyond, or to mount communist insurrections from within Western Europe. So who would step into the global vacuum to maintain order? At the time, America stood tall, uniquely tall. Its mainland was untouched by war. No bombs had flattened its cities, no troops had overrun its farms. And its economy, fueled by the war, had completely recovered from the Great Depression and was overwhelmingly dominating the world economy. But for 150 years, America had practiced a homegrown isolationism. It was largely guided by George Washington's warning in his farewell address of 1796 to, quote, steer clear of permanent alliances. As recently as after World War I, America had once again turned inward, rejecting the League of Nations, largely disarming and erecting huge new trade barriers. And as recently as 1939 and 1940 and even 1941, America was largely isolationist, which greatly limited Roosevelt's efforts to help Great Britain as it fought desperately to hold on against Germany. Now, with World War II ending, our leaders face strong public pressure to once again, quote, bring the boys home as soon as possible. The wives of soldiers sent letters to Congress, often with baby pictures and even baby shoes stuffed inside. And influential columnists like Drew Pearson were arguing strongly that America's resources were better spent here in the United States. So there was nothing inevitable about America's decision to assume global leadership and to create and lead the free world. It was Truman and Vandenberg who made this happen. So what did they do? Well, from the spring of 1945 through the summer of 1949, in just 4.5 years, Truman and Vandenberg worked together to create a revolutionary new American foreign policy. And with it, America assumed global leadership for the first time on a sustained basis to protect our friends, confront our enemies, and promote freedom. Their bipartisan foreign policy had 4 elements. Under their leadership, the United States first spearheaded the birth of the United Nations to replace the ineffective League of Nations. Second, pledged through the Truman Doctrine to defend freedom from communist threat virtually anywhere in the world. Third, rescued Western Europe's economy through the Marshall Plan. And fourth, committed through the North Atlantic Treaty, which created NATO, to defend Western Europe if the Soviets attacked. With this revolutionary new foreign policy, Truman and Vandenberg transformed America from a reluctant global presence to a self-confident leader. From a nation that traditionally turned inward after war to one that stayed engaged to shape the post-war world. And from a nation with no real military establishment to one that today spends more on defense than the next dozen or so nations combined. Charles Bolin, who was a very influential diplomat of that period, later wrote that it was, quote, the transition from total protected isolationism as the most secure and non-military country in the world to the greatest responsibility that any single country has ever borne in the history of the world. And Truman and Vandenberg overcame great obstacles to do it. After all, they worked together in bipartisan fashion at a bitterly partisan time. These were years of reckless demagoguery that laid the groundwork for the McCarthyism that would come a few years later. Congress held hearings on un-American activities. Republicans accused Truman and the Democrats of communist leanings. Truman tried to protect himself politically by creating a loyalty program for federal workers. And civil servants, professors, and others who came under suspicion lost their jobs. Keep in mind, this was all in the late 1940s, all before Joe McCarthy had delivered his first speech about communists in government. Republicans were angry about Roosevelt's 4 straight victories, and they were determined to bring Democratic rule to an end. In the elections of 1946 and 48, Republicans and Democrats attacked one another in vicious, personal language that far exceeds what is considered acceptable today. Yes, even today. Republicans questioned not just the judgment of Democrats, but their patriotism. A young House Republican candidate by the name of Richard Nixon won his seat in 1946 by calling the Democratic incumbent a communist. And I think more to the point, Republican National Committee Chairman Carol Reese called the congressional elections in 1946 a, quote, fight basically between communism and republicanism. And Truman compared his 1948 Republican opponent, Thomas Dewey, who was really a middle-of-the-road Republican governor from New York, to Adolf Hitler, and said he was a tool of fascist elements in the Republican Party. Of course, Truman and Vandenberg couldn't remove themselves from the politics of the day, even if they had wanted to. Vandenberg, as expected, won a fourth straight Senate term overwhelmingly in 1946, and Truman shocked everybody but himself by winning re-election in 1948. When they weren't running for office, each did whatever he could to help his party at election time. But on foreign policy, this Democratic president and this Republican senator never lost sight of the big picture. They never sidestepped the monumental challenge of Soviet aggression and the awesome new role that only America could assume. They never forgot that to reach their goals, they needed each other. So, who were these men? Well, they were born just 47 days apart in the spring of 1884. Truman in the tiny rural town of Lamar, Missouri, and Vandenberg in the lumbering center of Grand Rapids, Michigan. As products of the great Midwest, they both grew up with a strong sense of Midwestern values, of right and wrong and honesty and integrity, that later shaped their views on foreign affairs. They both experienced real life at an early age. They both watched their fathers struggle financially. They both worked during grade school to help pay the family bills. They both attended college for only 1 year because they didn't have the money to go longer. They were both unusually serious and wise as youngsters. Truman spent much of his childhood reading in the local library because his thick glasses kept him from playing sports. He read mostly history, but also biography. Caesar, Cicero, Ralph Waldo Emerson, Mark Twain. That's as a youngster. Vandenberg, as a youngster, gave lectures on all sorts of subjects that he invited adults to hear. And in high school, he was already reading the congressional record, and he had decided that he wanted to be a senator. Both Truman and Vandenberg inherited their different political parties and political philosophies from their families, in particular their fathers. But for all of their similarities in how they grew up, they were very different in personality and style as adults. Truman, for instance, was modest about himself. When he would receive an honor of some sort, he would often write in letters or his diary, quote, "Ain't that sumpin'?" Sumpin', S-O-M-P-I-N, ain't that sumpin'? Vandenberg, on the other hand, was vain and pompous, and he required constant stroking to keep him happy. When Senator Robert Taft asked his wife Martha to butter up Van, as he was widely known, Van, at a dinner, she later said, quote, "I tried manfully, but he buttered himself so thoroughly that I really couldn't find a single ungreased spot." Truman hated the self-important. He called General Douglas MacArthur, with whom he later clashed very publicly, quote, "Mr. Prima Donna Brass Hat 5-Star MacArthur." And he said of him, "He's worse than the Cabots and the Lodges. They at least talked to one another before they told God what to do." Mac tells God right off. Vandenberg, ironically, also was self-important. Here's how Dean Acheson, the former Secretary of State, later described an incident that he had with Vandenberg in 1943. "Without warning, a hurricane struck. Its center was filled with a large mass of cumulonimbus cloud, often called Arthur Vandenberg, producing heavy wordfall. Senator Vandenberg, for whom I came to have great respect and considerable admiration, had the rare capacity for instant indignation, often before he understood an issue or even that there was one. Truman was insecure as a public speaker, and he favored short, simple, straightforward language. Clark Clifford, the White House counsel, used to Trumanize his speeches beforehand by changing words of many syllables into words of just one or two. When Truman enunciated the Truman Doctrine, he began his speech this way: "The gravity of the situation which confronts the world today is my appearance before a joint session of the Congress. The foreign policy and the national security of this country are involved." Not exactly poetic. Vandenberg, on the other hand, loved public speaking. He loved flowery language and poetic phrases. He wrote his speeches over and over again on his manual typewriter, a cigar dangling from his lips, and they became must-see events in the Senate. For the Marshall Plan, Vandenberg rewrote his Senate speech 7 times. It ran 9,000 words, and he needed an hour and 20 minutes to deliver it. As he wrapped it up, he said, "There is only one voice left in the world which is competent to hearten the determination of the other nations and other peoples in Western Europe to survive in their own choice of their own way of life. It is our voice. It is in part the Senate's voice. Surely we can all agree, whatever our shades of opinion, that the hour has struck for this voice to speak as soon as possible. I pray it speaks for weal and not for woe." He said that the Marshall Plan can be, quote, "the turning point in history for 100 years to come. If it fails, we have done our final best. If it succeeds, our children and our children's children will call us blessed. May God grant his benediction upon the ultimate event." When Vandenberg finished, and this was not unusual when he gave a major address, senators jumped to their feet and loudly applauded, and virtually every single one went over to shake his hand. And finally, Truman was mean and crass and vengeful, and he had a long memory for insults and criticism. After the 1948 election, he fired the chief of the Secret Service for visiting Thomas Dewey's campaign headquarters on election night. And he fired the chairman of the National Security Resources Board after his wife suggested that the wives of administration officials wear black to her election night party because, after all, they should dress appropriately for Truman's certain defeat. Vandenberg, on the other hand, was gracious and forgiving. Although Roosevelt insulted him badly at a White House event in 1939, Vandenberg nevertheless paid him an extraordinary tribute at the Gridiron Dinner the following year, telling the audience, quote, "However much we may quarrel over policy, there is one point at which I can join his loudest psalm singers. Speaking of the man himself, I do not hesitate to say that I never knew a more gallant soul who has laughed triumphantly at the handicaps of life and given his country a superb example of personal courage and a personal challenge to carry on to victory, no matter what the burden, no matter what the odds. His example to us in this regard has never been equal, and it will never be excelled." So in many ways, Truman and Vandenberg each had qualities that were the opposite of the others, and even that the other hated. So how did two such different men work together to such great effect? This Democratic president and this Republican senator succeeded on such a grand scale because, first, they shared a vision for what America must do at a very perilous time. They saw that America must shed its isolationism for good, grab global leadership, rebuild Europe's economy, and lead the fight against the Soviets. Second, Vandenberg enjoyed a national stature as his party's undisputed leader on foreign policy that any senator today would envy. And with that stature, he exerted enormous influence over his Republican colleagues. Those Republicans, in turn, were willing to work with Truman on foreign policy while they fought him bitterly on domestic policy. Third, and most of all, Truman and Vandenberg would not let their differences in personality and style or the politics around them threatened the job at hand. If Vandenberg needed stroking before he would cooperate, Truman provided it. If Truman became mean and petty, Vandenberg would save the day with his grace. If the two men needed to communicate privately during times when their parties were fighting publicly, they did so. If they were leaders of different political parties at a bitterly partisan time, they would not let the partisanship around them destroy their partnership. Ladies and gentlemen, as I conclude, I think we would be wise to recognize at this moment of great political turmoil in America that history has no inevitabilities to it. Our leaders often tell us otherwise. They talk about the unstoppable momentum around the world towards freedom, as one of our recent presidents did, or they talk about tides of war that are inevitably receding, as our current president does. But the truth is far more complicated. Freedom does not always ring, and democracies do not always last. So looking back to the late 1940s, we can see how lucky we were. We were lucky in 1944 that President Roosevelt dumped Vice President Henry Wallace, who later became an embarrassing Soviet sympathizer, and chose Truman as his running mate that year. We were lucky that in 1928, when Vandenberg was agonizing like Hamlet over whether to run for the Senate that year, the Democratic incumbent unexpectedly died and the Republican governor appointed Vandenberg to the open seat. We were lucky as well that Truman was advised by such wise men, all of whom also worked closely with Vandenberg. Secretaries of State like Dean Acheson and George Marshall, and top State Department officials like Robert Lovett, Averell Harriman, Charles Bolin, Will Clayton, and George Kennan. And we were lucky that Vandenberg had colleagues in Congress to work closely with. Tom Connolly, the top Democrat on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Charles Eaton, the top Republican on the House Foreign Affairs Committee. And as I've said, his own Senate Republican colleagues who were willing to take Vandenberg's lead on foreign affairs while they fought Truman on domestic issues. So we were lucky. If not for Truman and Vandenberg, the world could have become a much different, much worse place. But of course, countries make their own luck. And we seem to find the leaders we need at moments of crisis, whether that's Washington with the nation's founding, or Lincoln with the Civil War, or Roosevelt with the Great Depression and World War II, or, as I would argue in this case, Truman and Vandenberg with the Soviet threat. So, here's hoping that in this very strange, if not sobering election year, and for many years to come, we continue to make our own luck. And with that, I thank you, and I'd be happy to take your questions.
We're adjusting his mics. Okay.
I'm now free of paper, and I can wander. Yes, sir.
I think people in the room are probably pretty familiar with President Truman's background. But could you tell us a little bit about Senator Vandenberg's background, perhaps his upbringing, education, and political background getting into the Senate?
Sure. So I've mentioned that he was born in the spring of 1884 in Grand Rapids, Michigan, a lumbering community. Relatively middle class, but his father went through tough times and they eventually went essentially bankrupt, and that was the reason why he had to work in grade school and why he could not find the funds to go to college for more than a year. What I did not mention is that before he got to the Senate, he had made his mark as a journalist. He worked for the Grand Rapids Herald and became its editor at the tender age of 22. He was writing all of the editorials, many of which were quite thoughtful. He was very active. It was an openly Republican-leaning newspaper, and he became a very public Republican activist. And the Grand Rapids Herald would often watch the Republicans in office from Michigan very closely and ensure that they were serving with a loyalty to Republican principles. He was not what you'd call a hardcore Republican in the way that we think of them today, and the party has moved farther to the right than it was back then, but he's what you would call a Main Street Republican. Believed in all else being equal, low taxes, low spending, limited government, looking out for the little guy, that kind of thing. So that's kind of the broad stroke on Arthur Vandenberg. Yes? You're
Yeah,
next.
So, if I can infer to, it seems like for today's leader, the Democrats and Republicans, to become bipartisan, that's only hope is there is some kind of threat from outside. If that's incorrect, what kind of lessons that today's leader can learn from Arthur and Truman?
So the question, since not everybody has a mic in here, the question has to do with whether the lesson is that that America can only act in a bipartisan way during moments of crisis. It is more complicated than that. I do know that I do recognize that I mentioned those moments of crisis. But no, actually, we have had a long tradition of both fighting bitterly and accomplishing when we've needed to accomplish, and it hasn't only been in moments of crisis. It's particularly acute in moments of crisis. We do come together very well in moments of crisis, but we do find some way of coming together when there's just a national need. Creating the interstate highway system in the 1950s, mission to the moon, war on poverty. Now, you know, these things have mixed successes to them, but we do find a way to make progress even while the parties are bitterly partisan, as they tend to be. So I would say partisanship is quite American. It is quite richly part of our culture, but so is bipartisan achievement, particularly during moments of crisis, but also on an ongoing basis, as long as we recognize that most of the things that we tend to do in America are incremental. We don't tend to launch revolutions in America. Our politics are played, to use a football analogy, between the 40-yard lines. I mean, a landslide in an American election is 53 to 47. You know, our largest margin of victory is once or twice it's been a 60-40 blowout. So we tend to be a centrist country. And after bitter elections, we do tend to govern, or at least accomplish, from the middle. And when our presidents or our Congresses try to govern too much on the outside of this centrist consensus, they don't tend to succeed. Let me say one more thing about sort of where we are going forward. And I wrote this in an op-ed that I published last week in a Washington newspaper. The ground is actually laid for more bipartisanship on foreign policy under the next president, whoever he or she may be, if they take advantage of it. And I say it for the following reason. If you look at the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and the House Foreign Affairs Committee, the chair, they're both in Republican hands, the Republican chair and the ranking Democrat, the top Democrat on both of those committees are centrist figures. At the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, the chairman is Bob Corker, a Republican from Tennessee, and the ranking Democrat is Ben Cardin from Maryland. These are not wildfire brands. These are not fire-eating members. These are centrists. And the same is true as at the House Foreign Affairs Committee, where the chairman is Ed Royce, a mainstream California Republican, and the top Democrat is Eliot Engel, a moderate Democrat from New York. So I really do believe that the next president can work effectively with Congress if that person reaches out to these four key figures who I absolutely believe would want to work more closely with the current president, with the next president that they've had the opportunity to work with the current president. You want to be next?
Did Mr. Vandenberg serve in WW1, perchance?
Okay, good question. What did Vandenberg do in World War I? So let me give you a little bit of a broader answer to your question.
I was looking for common ground between he and Harry.
Right, and here's where I'm going to give you the contrast. Both Truman and Vandenberg, as young men, were very supportive of Woodrow Wilson's call to enter World War I to make the world safe for democracy. Both of them were very supportive of that notion. They both supported American entry into World War I in 1917. They did it in different ways. Harry Truman, as many of you know, signed up and served. He served overseas, particularly in the last year of the war, 1918. Vandenberg did not. He was an editor at the Grand Rapids Herald, as I mentioned, and he wrote very supportive editorials about what America should be doing around the world. Now, I do want to broaden this answer a little bit because it leads to something else. Harry Truman was very consistent in believing that America had an important role to play on the world stage. Arthur Vandenberg was not. He took an intellectual journey. He started off the way I'm describing, believing that America had this role, that America should enter World War I and all the rest. He became a senator in 1928. He maintained that stance until the mid-1930s, when he became a member of what was known as the Nye Committee, which was set up by Senator Nye to investigate the reasons for American entry into World War I. And he came away convinced that America was tricked into the war by bankers and weapons makers who wanted to make money off of the war. And he became a strident isolationist in the late 1930s. So much so that he opposed Lend-Lease, Roosevelt's effort to help Great Britain hold off against Germany. It was not until Pearl Harbor that he was shaken out of his isolationism and came to the realization that warfare had developed to such a sophisticated extent that America was no longer safe with the Atlantic Ocean on one side and the Pacific Ocean on the other, and friendly neighbors to the north and the south. Okay? So as they came together after World War II and saw the Soviet threat the same way, they were marching in lockstep. But Vandenberg took an intellectual journey to get there. Yes, back here.
I'd like you to comment on change to your title. It would say, the partnership that created the free world in Europe and near constant crisis in Asia.
And the reason you want me to do that is because?
I don't have any disagreement of what happened in Europe, but between the Korean War and the Vietnam War and the Taiwan crises, the policies were European-oriented or did not work as well in Asia, or the area wasn't worked as hard.
Yeah, so the question has to do with whether it really ought to focus on the partnership that created the free world in Europe as opposed to Asia, where we've had more problems. I think your point is partially well taken. I'll say that it's partially well taken in the sense that when Truman and Vandenberg were working together, there was clearly more of a focus on what the Soviets might do in Europe. I think that is a fair point. There was more sort of US focus on Europe in any case. And of course, NATO was really most focused on protecting Western Europe. So all of that, I think I would agree with. Where I don't think I agree with you is that while I recognize that the Korean War ended in stalemate, and in essence, Vietnam ended in stalemate as well and had a much more controversial ending to it, it is still the case that the architecture of the free world really relates to a US-led world of allies who the United States defends, adversaries that we confront, and freedom that we promote all over the world. Europe, Asia, Africa, Latin America, South America. There is something that ties this together. And while I appreciate the fact that you're focused on Korea and Vietnam, the fact of the matter is that we lead the free world in Asia as much as we lead it in Europe, which is why our alliances in Asia are now growing stronger, because in the Philippines and ironically Vietnam and Thailand and New Zealand and Australia and the other Western-leaning powers, there is more fear of China. And the US-led alliance structure is actually strengthening in Asia while it may be having more problems in Europe. So I partly agree with you and partly don't. Yes?
Was Vandenberg aware of the Manhattan Project? Truman was kept out of the loop for some reason, but was Vandenberg informed of what was going on?
You know, I would have to jog my memory on this. You are 100% right about Truman. And in fact, he, as a senator, began to pick up some intelligence about it and tried to find out more. And if memory serves me, Henry Stimson told him to mind his own business because this was not something that the administration could talk about. And Truman, to his credit, did take a hint and step back. He did not learn really officially about the Manhattan Project until he became not vice president, but president. He didn't know about it as vice president. Arthur Vandenberg, I don't want to give you a half-hearted answer. I think he knew about it, but to be honest with you, I'm just not sure. So I'm sorry I can't answer that question. Yes?
Going back to Asia.
Yes.
And bipartisanship.
Yes.
When did Vandenberg leave the Senate? Just preface to my question.
Okay, so that's a two-part answer. Because one is when did he leave the Senate, and the second is when did he effectively stop working in the Senate. He got sick in 1949. And the period between 1949 and 1951, he was working less and less. And not coincidentally, foreign affairs were becoming more and more partisan in his absence.
That was the question.
Yes.
With the defeat of Dewey in '48 and then the fall of China.
China, obviously, particularly with Vandenberg's absence, the fall of China unleashed partisanship in foreign affairs that we had not seen. The struggles in Korea made it even worse. And my book ends on, I think, an important symbolic note, which is that Arthur Vandenberg died on April 18th, 1951. On April 19th, 1951, a fired Douglas MacArthur addressed the joint session of Congress, and at that time, Republican leaders were talking about responding to Truman's firing of MacArthur by impeaching Truman. By then, Vandenberg was gone. He effectively had been gone from the Senate for almost 2 years in terms of his influence, and it is no coincidence in my mind that Vandenberg's departure led increasingly to the kind of bitter partisanship on foreign affairs that we were seeing throughout that entire period on domestic affairs.
Can I just, what I think Dean Acheson called it the revolt of the primitives.
The revolt of the primitives,
And
that's correct.
How did the primitives view Vandenberg, given that they were primarily of his party, but had, during the European phase of bipartisanship, had been held pretty much in check or had gone along?
Right.
How did they view his efforts, and how readily did they push him aside, although you indicate part of that would have been illness?
Yeah, well, no, it was 100% illness.
Okay.
They did not push him aside. It was 100% illness. Having said that, I do not want people to leave here with the impression that Arthur Vandenberg opined and every Republican senator marched in line. It was not like that. On some of these major initiatives, the UN, where there was broad bipartisan support, but more to the point, the Truman Doctrine and its first manifestation in aid to Greece and Turkey, $400 million in aid, the Marshall Plan and that huge expenditure, and the North Atlantic Treaty, there was on the Senate floor between Vandenberg and some of his Republican colleagues. He had major debates over spending money with Robert Taft, who was quite the isolationist and quite the limited government, low taxes Republican leader on the domestic side. Vandenberg always had, on every major issue, a majority of Republicans with him, but he had to work for it. He had to work for it, and he worked very hard. He had an expression that he would use from time to time, whether he was talking about his work in committee or on the Senate floor. He used to tell the Chief of Staff at the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Francis Wilcox, "We'll kill them with kindness." And what he meant was he would hold more and more hearings so that people could air their grievances and ask as many questions of Secretary of State Acheson or Marshall or any other administration official that they wanted, or of Vandenberg himself. So he almost always tried to build a unanimous Senate committee vote if he could find one, or at the very least an overwhelming vote, which would give whatever the initiative was a lot of momentum when it went to the Senate floor. And he would spend whatever time he needed on the Senate floor to answer every question that came up. The battles were brutal. He did not avoid them. Most Republicans took their lead from Vandenberg, but not everyone did, and not without battle on many occasions.
One or two
Yes.
more questions?
One or two more questions?
Two.
Two more questions. Okay, right here.
Well, you've mentioned about the problems within the Republican Party. Tell us something about the Democratic Party at that time, because, of course, we had the split in '48 with the Dixiecrats and the Henry Wallace wing breaking off. What sort of problems existed in the Democratic Party at that time?
Absolutely correct. I'll tell you about it as related to foreign affairs, because
That's the point of my question.
Okay.
I didn't make that clear.
No, that's quite all right. I mentioned the battles that Vandenberg had with Robert Taft in his own party. There were some very strident isolationists, and also some, to be honest with you, Soviet sympathizing isolationists within the Democratic Party. Many of you may remember the former senator and then longtime House member Claude Pepper, who became very famous in protecting Social Security and all the rest. Well, back then, this is a Democrat, back then they called Claude Pepper Red Pepper, because he was a Soviet sympathizer. And he gave Truman and Vandenberg fits because he strongly opposed the Truman Doctrine and strongly opposed the other initiatives to spend money. He wanted everything done by the UN, even though the UN did not really have the capacity to do the kinds of things we're talking about. And there were other Democratic senators and House members who did not go along with the major Truman initiatives. But like Vandenberg had most Republicans, Truman had most Democrats in both parties. But there were struggles in both parties to get this consensus. Yes? Well, I'm sorry. I should have called for the last one on somebody who has not asked the question yet, if that's okay. So I will make you last. And I would be happy to talk to you later, if that's okay.
Well, the issue of Asia and
Yes.
success there was raised. The redevelopment of Japan,
Yes.
keeping the Soviets out of there, would seem to be a shining example of things actually being done quite well.
Without a doubt. In fact, two of the most remarkable things that happened after World War II was the United States finding itself, after lots of very hard work and a very dedicated American presence for many years, which we should all keep in mind when it comes to America's role in the world, turning Japan into an ally and turning first Western Germany and then all of Germany into an ally. They are shining examples of why it is important to have a strong American role and why, in essence, I would argue, the stronger the American role, notwithstanding problems that occur from time to time, I recognize, but the stronger American role, the more peace and prosperity, and the better off that is, not just for the world, but for us. A strong American role around the world, and some of the phraseology that I'm using, which sounds quite moral, promoting freedom and protecting our friends and confronting our adversaries, this is not just a moral issue. This is an issue of self-interest. We benefit from a strong American role in the world, and that's why it is particularly distressing to see the kind of campaign that we're seeing today with leading presidential candidates questioning this American role and leaders and leading candidates of both parties walking away on the economic side to the benefits that we have seen over the last 70 to 75 years on the free trade regime that we have set up and largely benefited from, even with some problems that we always are going to confront when it comes to free versus fair trade. In any case, I'm sorry that we have to end it here. I'd be happy to have more conversations with you outside, particularly if you line up to get my signature.